Hi, class. I wanted you to take a look at that sheet you were supposed to download for the timeline of Old Testament events. And you'll notice there are three columns, and they should correspond to what you see here on the PowerPoint: world history, biblical history, and then the approximate date, because sometimes the events that we're talking about, we're not exactly sure when they took place. But there are some instances where we have a pretty good idea of when they take place. So let's begin with that first line, creation. Now, creation, we aren't sure how long ago it really was. The Bible doesn't say. Now, there are people who say that the earth is only a few thousand years old. There are others who say it's 1,000,000 years old. Here's what I believe we should say: we should say nothing more nor nothing less than what the Bible says. And the Bible doesn't say anything about it. And so that's why there's a question mark there. Now, the other thing that I want us to understand in terms of events is that there is a major event in the book of Genesis called the flood. You know it well with Noah and so forth. And again, we're not exactly sure when it happened. So there's a question mark there too. All you really need to know is that the order was, well, first there was creation, and then secondly, you have a little bit further down the line the flood. And both events were a real long time ago. That's what the Bible leads us to believe. Then you have the event of the Tower of Babel. Once again, we're not exactly sure how long ago that event was, but it did take place after the flood. Now, we are getting into the era of where we can put some dates. And the birth of the first civilizations, as historians define civilization, and we're looking at the civilizations specifically of Egypt and Mesopotamia. We're talking about the year around 3000 BC. Whenever you see in that third column there a little c with a period after it, that means circa, and that means about the time of. And the time that we're looking at there is 3000 BC. That's 3,000 years before Christ. Now, some history books will use the abbreviation BCE, which refers to before the Common Era. But whether it's BCE or BC, they refer to the same time nonetheless. Okay, so the Old Babylonian Empire, and then there's the Egyptian kingdoms, which strengthen. And it's during that time, somewhere in there, where Abraham, in the book of Genesis again, leaves the land of Ur. And so the era or the age of the patriarchs, and that refers to the fathers, rather, of the nation of Israel, that takes place around the year 2000 BC. Now let's keep going. And now we're talking about, well, okay, so when did the Israelites end up in Egypt? So there's Abraham, who leaves Ur, and in class we discussed where that area was, or we will discuss, depending on when you watch this video. And the time when the Israelites enter into Egypt, remember, this is after Joseph and his brothers all moved down there and so on and so forth because of the famine going on in Palestine and Israel. Well, that's around the year 1720 BC. You'll notice we're going backwards when you're doing BC, of course, because we're counting backwards to the time of the birth of Christ. That's what the BC refers to. When did the Israelites leave Egypt? 1280 BC. So they're there for roughly 440 years is what that timeline would suggest there. And then the Empire of Assyria, which is in modern day Iran, Iraq. And as they are rising as an empire, this is when the Israelites are entering into the promised land. And this is the era of the judges that are ruling the Israelites. They don't yet have a king. And this is the year around 1240 BC. Egypt, over a period of time, weakens as an empire. And now the Israelites have kings, starting with Saul, then going to David, and then Solomon. And those three kings are known as the leaders of what's called the United Monarchy. That's from the years 1050 to 930 BC. So about 120 years all told. And then when Babylon, another empire, rises that ends up defeating the Assyrians, we see that there's an awful lot of pressure that Assyria applies to Israel, as well as Babylon, and eventually we see that the kingdom that was united split. More on that in an upcoming class. But the time when the empire splits, when the kingdom of Israel splits, it's not really an empire per se, was 930 BC. Now let's keep moving on the timeline. The Assyrian Empire continues to remain strong. It finally falls in the year 612 BC. And the northern kingdom of Israel, remember, it's split into two parts. The northern kingdom known as Israel, the southern kingdom known as Judah. Well, the northern kingdom of Israel eventually falls to Assyria in the year 722 or 721, some think, BC. It could have been over a period of those 2 years. The Babylonian Empire, which is very strong but eventually falls in the year 539 BC, is the empire that overcomes and defeats the southern kingdom of Judah. So they fall to Babylon, and the year is 586 BC. The Persians, they rise as an empire, and they defeat essentially what is left of the Babylonian Empire. And it's during the Persian Empire that we see the exiles, those who have been thrown out of the land of Israel and Judah and have been taken into captivity. Those exiles who've been living in the empires of Assyria and Babylon and now Persia, they're now allowed to return. More on the details of all that surrounds that great event as we move along in our class. But for now, I want you to know the year is 538 BC. And that's the time when Jerusalem is rebuilt. And then the temple is rebuilt in 520 BC. Things don't happen overnight. So these are an awful lot of events that take place over the course of, well, we don't know how many years, because remember, if you go all the way back to creation, which we're going to cover in Genesis very soon, we don't know how long ago that really was. The important thing is, it was a very long time. And now we can look at these dates and see what exactly is happening when. So you may want to refer back to this video, or at the very least to the sheet that you've filled in on the basis of what you viewed in this video. But I look forward to hearing any of your questions. You can always message me, and I look forward to discussing this more in class. Take care.